on the clap.
Donald Trump and Republicans are attacking President Harris over her past comments on transgender issues. Take a listen.
In the final weeks leading up to the U.S. presidential election, Republican nominee Donald Trump has spent millions on this ad campaign.
Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners.
Surgery. But how significant is the issue?
Every transgender
insanity, the hell out of our schools.
Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance frequently bring the topic up at rallies and in
more than 30,000 times, including key battleground stations focused on NFL.
At one such Vance rally in Portage, Michigan.
TV this month, especially sports like football or baseball, you've likely seen campaign ads supporting Donald Trump by attacking Kamala Harris over transgender issues.
Does it make even a little bit of sense? I wouldn't say a modicum of it. Will it be stopped? Only time will tell. And unfortunately, I don't have her number. She probably already has button eyes anyway. Oh, hello, Frank. During the events leading up to the 2024 U.S. election results, Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans campaigned heavily on transgender issues, among other things. Now, I'm unsure of the exact amount of money that was spent on ads. Different sources say different things. Like, for example, ABC said that they spent $21 million. NBC said that they spent nearly $60 million. And the Drum said that they spent a whopping $215 million. Regardless, it was a lot of money and a compelling case that capitalism truly is at the root of everything. But no, this is not a video about capitalism. Or is it? Ooh, capitalism. Ooh. No, this is about failure. Because the ads failed. The Trump campaign and Republican groups spent millions of dollars on anti-queer and especially anti-trans ads. Ads designed to provoke, to anger, to radicalize, and to dehumanize. And they failed. At least according to the data. The Trump campaign did not fail overall because care feels don't about facts or something. The United States president for the next 4 years, the first one to return to the office in more than 130 years, and at 78, the oldest man ever elected to the role will be Donald Trump. 78, is that right? Are we sure about that? Did I do my research correctly? How old? Wow, he is 78. And yet, his anti-trans rhetoric, which he had been running on for the entirety of his campaign as one of his most major issues, failed. Tens of millions of dollars spent in an effort to advertise hate. Voters think parties should spend less time on transgender issues. Voters trust Democrats more to handle transgender issues. Voters say Republicans have a more extreme stance on transgender issues. A majority of voters would vote for a candidate who supports transgender rights over one who doesn't. Voters reject candidates who support anti-trans legislation. Across party lines, voters want the government to be less involved in transgender people's lives. Voters agree trans people should be treated with respect and disagree with the use of anti-trans political ads. Voters think that there is too much legislation targeting transgender people. According to the surveys done by Data for Progress, it turns out most people aren't radical butts with butts up their butts. Most people care about other people, even if they don't understand their lifestyle or their identity. Just like how I tolerate with people who say they don't like being critical and then criticize me for putting everything into a burrito. Everything's better in a burrito, okay? This is an unequivocal fact, and I will die on this stained red hit quote. Data for Progress has consistently found that voters see the economy, jobs, and inflation as the most important issue for them when deciding which candidate to vote for. while LGBTQ plus issues trail far behind as a motivating factor in vote choice. End quote. Part 2, a bit of history. This is a nice painting that I didn't do. Transgender rights have been entangled with political agendas for a really long time. The nature of the politics of difference dictates that personal identity and basic human rights are transformed into contentious political issues. And this shows in how history has treated transgender people. One of the first openly transgender individuals in the US was Christine Jorgensen, whose transition sparked media frenzy during the 1950s. The framing of the transgender identity at the time was as a sort of medical anomaly. And early debates often centered around whether transgender identities were legitimate or a psychological issue. I'm not a they. I'm not a they them. I'm not a he she. I'm a psychological / issue. Those are my pronouns. In 1993, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill excluded openly transgender service members indirectly by focusing on gender nonconformity. In 2017, President Donald Trump announced via Twitter a ban on transgender individuals serving in the military, and this was later reversed in 2021 by President Joe Biden. 2017 was also the year that a portion of a law in North Carolina was repealed. A year earlier, in 2016, North Carolina's HB 2 law mandated that individuals use bathrooms corresponding to the sex of their birth certificate. Advocates for the bill cited safety concerns, despite the lack of evidence supporting claims that allowing trans people into the bathrooms of their choice would harm anyone. In the mid 20th century, gender verification tests, introduced in international sports, disproportionately targeted women with non normative appearances. And these tests were not fun. They were in fact quite invasive. They had to check out the bits, the down there, the down there bits, the one, and we can see this suspicion of gender in as recent as the 2020s with the recent scrutiny of transgender athletes, which in and of itself is a refreshed resurgence of the framing of trans women as a threat, this time to women's sports. In the recent 2024 Olympic Games, there was backlash against the boxers Iman Khalif of Algeria and Lin Yu Ting of Taiwan, with accusations flung at them from all across the internet about their supposed biological advantages because of them being transgender. As it turns out, these athletes were indeed cisgender. Not that it was any of our business to begin with, but did the people who accused these women of being men care about any semblance of justice, equity, or the protection of women? I'd wager the answer is no. And to figure out why transphobia has been leaking out and affecting other groups, namely cisgender women, we need to talk a little bit about transvestigation. Part 3, transvestigation. Unfortunately, transvestigation is not describing a bunch of trans people in a minivan driving around and solving mysteries around town. I would be so happy to have that in my life. No, transvestigation is the practice of investigating a person and figuring out if they are trans or not for the purpose of outing them, usually through online mediums. I mean, Rule 34, guys. I'm not here to kink shame, anything and everything. But the vast majority of the people who are transvestigated turn out to be cisgender people whose gender identity simply does not present as traditional. And you don't have to take my word for it. The YouTube channel Doki Doki Discourse did a very good video where they found numerous examples of transphobia affecting cis people. Go watch it for yourself to see the insanity and the madness of this. I also highly recommend you go and watch or listen to the episode on transvestigation from Matt Bernstein on his podcast A Bit Fruity. He gives an amazing history and analysis of the controversy surrounding the two boxers in the Olympics. Transphobia works because fear is extremely effective. The transphobic propaganda was designed to scare suburban moms, demonize trans people, and frame cisgender women as the victims of some imaginary trans takeover. No, it's correct. It's correct. We are taking over. Think of the children. Protect our bathrooms. Sanctity of women's sports. All of this rhetoric boils down to fear-mongering, creating a false dichotomy between quote-unquote real women, cis women, and, the others, trans women. Trump's campaign may have won him the presidency, but his obsession with trans issues flopped on the surface. So why did they double down on this hate? Because transphobia isn't just about targeting trans people, although that certainly is a large and very prominent part of it. But it's also a way to polarize voters, distract from real issues like the economy, and galvanize a base that thrives on fear. At the end of the day, transphobia is a tool. It stokes the flames of outrage and keeps people glued to their screens. Outrage fills campaign coffers. Outrage gives politicians a common enemy to rally against. At its core, transphobia is about control over bodies, over narratives, over the way we perceive gender and power. And while it's tempting to dismiss transvestigation as a ridiculous internet rabbit hole, it's a part of a much larger and doormangerous picture. So let's zoom out to this larger and more dangerous picture. Oh, no, that's too far. They can see the lights. They can see the surroundings. No, turn it off. Turn the cameras off. In November 2020, IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization, commissioned a report to analyze how the UK's media has handled transgender-related coverage over the last 10 years. The findings are mixed, like a peanut butter sandwich. There are some positives. Like in general, the volume of transgender-related stories has skyrocketed, especially in the past 5 years. It's no longer just tabloids obsessing over Caitlyn Jenner or sensationalizing people's transitions. More publications are diving into policy discussions or examining issues affecting trans youth. Offensive terms like tranny or gender bender are practically extinct in mainstream reporting, and this is progress. But the way stories are framed and the language that is still used is oftentimes a problem and maintains itself as a problem. For example, terms like sex change are still hanging on, though gender reassignment is now more common. And misleading statistics pop up all the time. The study that many people derive the 48% of trans youth attempt suicide statistic. Editing Silvio here. So it's 80% of trans people detransition. That was the statistic. I was completely wrong, and sorry about that. Was done on just 27 people. You cannot base sweeping claims on a sample size larger than the average group chat, although that would be a hefty group chat. See this excellent video from Genetically Modified Skeptic on how this myth spreads and the inadequacies of the actual study. And then there is non-binary erasure. While the number of stories mentioning non-binary identities has increased, many editors still resist using they, them pronouns because they think readers won't understand. And while the IPSO report analyzes media in the UK only, we can see examples of these very things in US media. A perfect example is one of the news clips I showed at the very beginning, where in the clip a self-identified non-binary person says that they use they, them pronouns, and then not 5 seconds later, the narration misgenders them.
Personally, I do identify as non-binary, so I use they, them pronouns, so I find it a little comical. I think it's a little funny.
In Grand Rapids, barista Clay Eiley says the Republican ads just reinforce his support for Harris.
It literally doesn't get more blatant than this. And this is Reuters, a news source that I considered to be more credible and reliable than other ones. I still do consider it, but it certainly hurts the reputation in my mind of the news source. And it truly is a bit disappointing. There are 3 ways that the coverage often looks, according to the Ipsos report. 1, trans as an anomaly. Think headlines like "Man Becomes Woman," sensationalism central. Number 2, human interest. Celebrities coming out, trans kids going viral for either being adorable or dead. And number 3, policy and rights. As trans issues started intersecting with children's health care, sports, and legal recognition, the tone shifted, and not necessarily in a good way. Articles about the policy are often framed to spark fear, especially in tabloids. They focus on the potential consequences for cisgender people, often portraying trans rights as a threat. Will women's sports survive the trans invasion? Are our prisons too woke to protect real women? Things like that. The report also highlights how social media plays a role. It's not just that Twitter amplifies bad takes, it's that editors are watching. They see what gets clicks, what makes people angry, and they lean into it. Outrage equals engagement, after all, and engagement equals money. Money keeps the machine running, and everyone's happy. Even when stories meet Ipsos' editorial standards, they're often designed to stoke division, because calm, nuanced takes don't go viral. And in this economy, who can afford not to go viral? I know I can. Let's talk about Coraline. You know, the story about a girl, a door, and a horrifying alternate universe where everything's the same, but not. Like if your favorite childhood home was drawn in Microsoft Paint, but really good Microsoft Paint. You probably know the drill. Coraline finds a door to a parallel world. Everything seems perfect. Better parents, better food, no one's making her clean her room. But things get weird when the other mother, this button-eyed mimic of her real mother, offers to sew buttons over Coraline's eyes so she can stay forever. Coraline, in her infinite preteen wisdom, says something along the lines of, "No thank you, I'd rather die," which is truly a snaps-worthy line. It's a story about choice, identity, autonomy, and it's also a pretty dang good metaphor for what I've been talking about this entire time. "Oh, you can exist," says the powerful creature. "But you have to look like this, and talk like this, and definitely not make the bathrooms uncomfortable for Karen from PTA." It's the same creature behind those millions of dollars in anti-trans ads, behind the transvestigators, the bathroom bills, the rhetoric about protecting women's sports. It promises safety and comfort while tightening its grip on who gets to exist and how. And you know what? The other mother also makes great souffles, but that doesn't mean you should trust her. And Karen has never been to a sports game. Coraline refuses the buttons because she knows what they mean, giving up her agency, her ability to define who she is. She could have stayed in that world, eating perfect souffles and living in a fantasy where nothing challenged her, but she doesn't. The other mother's world is comforting, sure. The colors are vibrant, real in a sense, but it's also suffocating. "Think of the children," they say. "Protect the sanctity of the bathrooms," they say. But what they're really saying is, wear the buttons, fit the mold. Let us decide who you are. The buttons don't stop at trans identities. The buttons are about power. The buttons want to take over. The buttons want to decide whose story gets told, who gets to be heard, who gets to take up space in the world. Maybe everything's about buttons, not capitalism. When Coraline slams the door on the other mother, She's not saying just no for herself. She's breaking the system for everyone else. She's making space for the real, messy, uncomfortable world where people aren't perfect and don't all look the same. And thank God for that. Because perfect soufflés are overrated, honestly. And Karen probably wouldn't even notice if the bathrooms disappeared entirely. Bathrooms are a concept, Karen. They're just like gender. The plumbing stays the same. I want to end this video off by talking about the tunnel. Not the colorful stop-motion carnival ride from the movie Coraline, but the one in the original book. The real one. The awful one. The tunnel is the passageway Coraline takes between her real world and the other mother's domain. At first, it's described as just cold and dark, a seemingly empty corridor. Unsettling, but manageable. And Coraline walks through it like it's nothing. Because why wouldn't she? It's just a tunnel, just a door, just a way to get from one place to another. Until it isn't. When Coraline makes her way back to the real world for the final time at the end of the book, the tunnel changes. She keeps her hand on the wall to guide her because it's dark. But then the wall becomes warm and fuzzy and it moves, like it's breathing. And when she touches it again later, it's hot and wet. Whatever the tunnel is, it's alive. It's ancient. Quote, older by far than the other mother, it was deep and slow, and it knew that she was there. This thing, this breathing, wet, knowing thing, isn't the villain of the story. It's not even a part of the other mother's world. It's something else entirely. A piece of the universe that isn't interested in Coraline's story at all. It doesn't want her soul. It doesn't want her to sew buttons in her eyes. It just exists. Indifferent to her presence, but aware of it nonetheless. And that's what makes it terrifying. On the surface, systems of oppression seem straightforward. Just cold and dark, like a tunnel you can walk through. But the deeper you go, the more you realize they're alive. They breathe. They know you're there. And they don't need you to believe in them. They're much older than you, much slower, much deeper. They don't care about your identity or your humanity. They only care about keeping you inside. Transphobia isn't just hateful ads or bathroom bills. It's not even just politicians using fear as a campaign strategy. Those are surface-level things. The cold, dark walls of the tunnel. The real horror is deeper. It's the way these systems have existed for centuries, shaping the very fabric of society. It's the way they're indifferent to individuality, swallowing people whole without ever acknowledging their existence. And when you realize that, when you feel the tunnel breathing, when you touch the wet, knowing walls, it's tempting to pull your hand away and just give up. To decide the system is too big, too old, too much. But Coraline doesn't stop. She doesn't run screaming from the tunnel or pretend it isn't there. She keeps walking. She puts her hand back on the wall, even though it's wet and hot and awful, because she refuses to get lost in the dark. And that's the lesson. Systems like transphobia want you to pull away, to stop fighting, to feel small and helpless in the face of something so deep and slow and uncaring. But the only way out is through. You refuse to let go of your sense of direction, no matter how horrifying the path, and you let them breathe. You let them move. You let them know you're here. And then you keep walking. And you don't stop. Now, if you excuse me, I'm off to start my trans detective agency. Because if there's one thing this world needs, it's trans people solving mysteries in a van.